Good afternoon and welcome to a policy forum on managing interdependencies and infrastructure systems for a resilient future. This session will unpack the manifestation and implications of interdependencies within and among infrastructure systems for a resilient future. Infrastructure systems are complex integration of subsystems. At present, there is decisive push towards building more sustainable and resilient infrastructure that requires a critical assessment of how these interdependencies will hinder or facilitate this transition. So this session will essentially draw out experiences and best practices of managing these interdependencies within a single, multiple, transnational or global infrastructure system. Our moderator for this session is Professor Aroma Ravi. He's a global practice and thought leader. He's an educator with over 35 years of interdisciplinary experience in sustainable development, public policy and governance, human settlements, global environmental and technological change. He is the co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where he helped lead a successful global campaign for an urban sustainable development goal as part of the UN's 2030 development agenda. Over to you, Professor Ravi.
Thank you so much. So welcome to this session. We're going to have a fairly interesting set of conversations across a fairly wide range of themes and topics. I was at the launch of the Global Assessment Report last week with the Deputy Secretary General of the UN in New York. And I think one of the most important things that we've seen in the last many years, the big shock, which I think it will be talking to us in the international system, was really with Fukushima in some senses, is the fact that we are now seeing the emergence of systemic risk. COVID is probably the most dramatic example of that. Systemic risk that is actually being propagated through the world because of interconnected infrastructure systems. If we didn't have, let's say, air transportation, then maybe the sort of outcome on the epidemiological side of COVID may have been somewhat different. So systemic risk has become something that's very critical, and systemic risk can happen within a particular infrastructure system, but it can also happen because of the compounding of a whole range of processes and events. And in some cases, like Fukushima is one example. We've seen other things happening, like in Bangkok, in other places, or even in other big events in other parts of the world. Is the cascading risk. Something starts in one sector, like again in COVID. Something starts as a crisis in the health sector and then expands to hit the entire global economy or particular economies, impacts poverty, impacts education in a dramatic way. In this country, we had 250 million children who were out of school for a very long period of time, etc. So we're trying to understand how these processes work within systems and between systems, because in an interconnected world where, let's say, network infrastructure is a kind of driving process, it's important to try and understand how they actually work, especially in the context, I would say, of low and middle income countries or developing countries, where to maintain resilience of traditional physical infrastructures is challenging enough. And as soon as you have interconnections, then you have a whole range of issues that are there. You have teleconnections that happen in some senses. So we have a very interesting sort of pool of people who are here. But I just thought I'd sort of try and make some connections that may be useful for us to look at, and that is that especially if you look, and I think Rebecca will be talking about this, especially if you look at questions of climate, you find a connection between one system and the other. And in fact, in the climate space, and we're in the middle of wrapping up the R6 cycle, I've been involved in that for the last 6 years or so. The critical question for us is, if you want to build what is now being accepted by country governments, something what we call climate resilient development, which is you try and achieve your development goals, which you may call the 2030 agenda or X and Y and Z, but in that you need to enable both adaptation and mitigation. So mitigation is about energy systems. Energy systems are very critical to deal with that, and but along with that, there are a whole range of other processes that are actually connected with that. So if you don't deal with water and connected sort of food systems, you actually have a cascading set of questions. And as we can see at the current point of time, a conflict which may seem relatively small in one part of the world is having cascading impacts across the world because of the connection in terms of availability and food security in different parts. So, many countries in Africa are experiencing food crisis in some senses. So it's not only the hard aspects of systems, which are very easy to connect with. So, like we've seen in India in the past. You have a massive flood in a city like Mumbai, and you're kind of you're not surprised, but it does happen that your entire telecommunication network goes down. Why is that so? Because you didn't think about hardening your power systems, and the power systems actually drive the sort of the processes which allow the towers to actually work. So the harder aspect is somewhat easier to see, but actually I think the more dramatic process that we're going to be seeing just now is in the softer limits that systems will actually sort of see and function. And then you have, you have significant responses to it. For example, Europe's response to what happened in Japan in terms of shifting their energy mix. So these interconnections create crises, and the crises also create opportunities to be able to harden not only a particular infrastructure, but the connection between them. Because at the end of the day, the final thing is, at least in my experience, dealing with services and improving the lives of people. So if you're not able to deal with that, and we're only focusing on the hard side, we're going to be, I think, both shocked and somewhat surprised. So, people in some senses and institutions are part of the infrastructure processes and networks. So we need to really look at how both the governance and the delivery and the strengthening of the human side of these processes, or the institutional sides, need to be dealt with. Because, you can harden an engineering system, and many of us have done this in many parts of the world, but effectively, if that doesn't interface with how vulnerability is changing or how exposure is changing, and those are very critical questions in many parts of the world, especially in the context of climate, you're going to have some places which are, in effect, over the next 20 or 30 years, more and more difficult to live in, and you may have to withdraw from some locations. So there are going to be some very sharp and dramatic changes that we'll see, and it's not only about flooding and drought and stuff like that, but with sea level rise and fire weather and permafrost melt in other places, we're going to see very dramatic changes. Things that in a sense are not sort of imaginable in the current world, the current point of time. So when we're talking about infrastructure systems, I think one of the core questions we have to look at is, because many of them have life cycles of 30 years at a minimum, some of them have 100-year life cycles, you're locking yourselves into both places and processes that need to be dealt with. And if you're not only locking yourself into one system but the interconnection with something else, then I think there are some deeply emerging challenges as far as that's concerned. So I'll sort of stop there, and then I'll quickly introduce the panel as we have it. The first colleague who's going to come in at the moment is a very well-known person in the disaster and resilience space. Dr. Miyamoto has been educated in Tokyo at the Tokyo Institute of Technology and California State University. He's a very well-known person on the seismic tectonic side, a member of the California Seismic Safety Commission, and he runs an institution that works not only in the structural engineering space, but in a whole range of questions in terms of reconstruction, response, and resilience. He's been very active across the world after Haiti, Ecuador, Nepal, Indonesia, New Zealand, Mexico, and of course the Puerto Rico earthquakes. So, he has a tremendous experience in dealing with these things at an international scale. And then we have Rebecca Nadine from the Overseas Development Institute. She's the director of the Global Risk and Resilience team there, and she has extensive experience in climate risk and national adaptation planning. We hope that she's going to be able to, help us look at the political economy of climate resilience and how that plays itself out. She has extensive experience in China, which I think is very interesting and important to us, because China, in some senses, has been both a leader and also quite an interesting space to be able to build resilience, not only within China itself, but because of the Belt and Road program in many other parts of the world. So in a sense, what China does has a dramatic influence, not only within within China, but outside it. And then we have Graham Bolton. Graham is the global aviation leader at Mott MacDonald, and the immediate past chair of the British Aviation Group. Extensive experience in the infrastructure sector, in strategic planning, in business transformation across major airports, pretty much across, I think, all geographies of the world. And he brings a lot of insight into how airports run and how global industry bodies actually work in terms of aviation. And aviation, I think, is one of the sectors that's seen serious challenges during the COVID pandemic. It's coming back in some senses, but it faces existential questions if we have to do things like bring it to close to net zero. And we have Garima Jain, who's the Gilbert White Fellow at Arizona State University, and her work lies at the interface of development, climate, and disaster risk. She focuses significantly on disaster recovery, housing, land, and infrastructure, and has co-edited a book on rethinking urban risk and resettlement in the global south. And again, she has extensive experience of working across a whole range of countries in the world, and also supporting the IPCC in its working group 2 on Asia. So that's a very distinguished panel, and I'll hope sort of we can pick up and open up a lively conversation here. But before we sort of get on to that, I think we have a set of questions, or at least a provocation, which the organizers would like me to set out. So I think for people who are on Zoom, the question really is, do you have any experiences, and you can share this in the chat box, where you're using services of an infrastructure system and you face challenges because some other critical infrastructure system was disrupted. I mean, there was a colleague who was meant to join us today. Andrew was kind of interrupted by a similar kind of event. We know this quite well. There was a transportation event and he couldn't catch his flight, and he's in midair at this point of time. So this is something that happens to us all over the world. And again, like I said, COVID has really taught us how important it is to be able to build resilience and redundancy in systems. So that's for the audience outside. But then I'm going to ask Kit to jump in. He's got a presentation, and then we'll pick it up from there and run with that. So Kit, over to you.
Thanks so much.
So can we have the presentation up, please, for Dr.
All right.
Yamamoto? Yeah.
Okay, next 10 minutes, I want to talk about the interdependency, how actually the mechanism work, and some of the best practices and the worst practices in the world. So just quickly, let me kind of describe the whole cascade events look like. For example, the event, let's talk about 2010 Haiti. There's magnitude 7.2 event happened near Port-au-Prince, which is affected area of the population, about 3 million people. So immediate consequence was that event killed about 300,000 people. Damaged or destroyed about 220,000 buildings out there. The immediate following consequences, because of the damage and shock, it caused about 1.2 million people to be homeless. Either their house is destroyed or too scared to be in it. So that was the immediate following consequences. After that, what happened is system-wise, they have nowhere to go. So what could happen to it? Huge, this IDP campsites. In one place, almost 50,000 people live in the middle of the Port-au-Prince. That just got to stay there because because as you know, Haiti is a poor country and there's no immediate support from domestically, so those people got stuck in a place. Then after that, it caused the large international support. That's the ripple effect, right? That money coming through the Haiti eventually to instigate the reconstruction. And after that, actually, because of that money coming through, not only, I would say after 5 years, you probably did not see that scar, of that earthquake per se, as far as the building stock is concerned. But also even our agency alone trained about 7,000 masons. But if you combine the others, probably tens of thousands of masons have just been trained. Today, their building practice is very different. It's actually, you see the international confirmed practices in so-called uncontrolled area. So those are like a consequence of event. Both bad and good could happen from events like that. This is 2011. You remember the magnitude 9 event happened near Sendai, the offshore. It caused a tsunami. It somewhat varies from 10 meters to 50 meters, even sometimes even higher than that. And there's a Fukushima plant, nuclear plant, if you remember that. And if you see the bottom, what happened there? And that got melted down, right? Here's a consequence event. The ground level is 10 meters high from a sea level. So assumption is that any kind of tsunami should be less than 10 meters. Because engineers like me said that. Based on the probabilistic analysis, 10 meters maximum high, you're going to get it. Okay, great. So 10 meters high. But actual tsunami was 14 to 15 meters in a particular area. So obviously water overload, right? And there was the power system from off-site coming through to cooling down the core. That's important. You got to keep cooling down. You need energy to cool down. That got broken. And guess what? Of course, there's an emergency generator to basically to keep cooling in case of a breakdown, right? But that emergency generator was, you see that? Basement. Can you imagine how confident engineers we are? So obviously that overflowed, flooded, take down the emergency generator, and core melt and hydrogen explosion. And to this day, essentially the whole area is not even go there. Half of province is gone. You see that the whole event coming through. That one is engineering kind of in a sense, we have an arrogant about certain building code, right? So here's a code that said this, so that's the 10 meter high. Okay. And if so, that emergency generator can be down there. If we spend, I don't know, 500,000 or more to make this emergency generator to say 10 meter higher than what it is, maybe even 5 meters. That didn't happen. You see, we don't know what we don't know. And just like me tell you, say here's what's going to happen, but we don't know that really. I think that's at the issues. So we don't know what we don't know. So one of the example try to address what we don't know. In LAX, it's an airport, and it's a pretty sizable one in California, obviously, and third business in the world, and sixth business in the world. And challenge here is, okay, how we can actually reduce the impact of potential seismic to this. And this is a picture from Santiago, Chile. The airport, Chile got the great engineers. And that earthquake did not cause much of the damage itself, the structural system. The ceiling came down. Some non-structural elements come down, shut down the whole airport. By the way, same thing happened in Sendai, Tohoku earthquake I was talking about. The train station, the Sendai station, completely fine, no structural damage at all whatsoever. But ceiling system came down, shut down the whole train system, which is a very important transportation system in Japan. Shut down for, it was almost like a couple months. It was incredible actually. Ceiling. See, little things makes a huge difference. So this particular thing, we looked at how we can actually reduce the business interruptions, BI. Because a business, to be airport, to be operational is a really critical function after that major disaster like earthquake, right? So look not only look at runway or terminal structural system, but also look at critical buildings and also infrastructure around it. How the communication system is set up, how the fuels transport to the airport, how the water system and power system connect into the whole airport system. So after we go through the thing, it's just that mark those terminals based on the potential business interruption days. Red means potentially disruption would be some certain weeks, and the yellow would be certain 3 weeks, and the green would be at less than 1 week, so on. So that would be a system like that kind of setup. But look not only structural system, but look the non-structural elements. That's very important. And how the power is transported into this airport, and see the potential redundancy system and the weakness of a link. So you have to kind of look the wholesome way in a way to see not only just the structural components, but emergency response from a city, how long it's going to take to get there. Because I think the timeline is so critical. For example, we helped Asian Development Bank, the headquarters in Manila. That headquarters sit right next to the West Valley Fault, humongous fault line there. And that building is it's a beautifully designed. Everything's great, right? So it seems okay. But problem is that we don't know what we don't know. Certain damage will happen. Could be just cracks in the wall. Could be ceiling maybe fall down certain little area. But once a certain damage happen, what happened is two things. One is that after the major disaster like that, people don't want to go back to that particular facilities. Second one is that if that happens, you have to wait for the damage assessment team to show up, usually done by Public Works. It may take weeks or months to get there. ADB doesn't mean you get the first, to show up. So what ADB decided to do is, I thought it's really smart. They want to actually create their own damage assessment team inside the facility management. So if that kind of event happens, they can assess right on spot. If the ceiling coming down, okay, just remove it. But they understand the whole structural system is okay. You know what I mean? It's kind of a preempt, something they don't know what they don't know type of approach. Let's go to Haiti back. It's a 2021, they got magnitude 7.2 earthquake again. This typical concrete structure collapse like that, right? The traditional building like that perform actually a little better, actually much more resilient. Because of those rocks kind of fall off, doesn't collapse. People don't die there, besides the concrete structure fails. What this means, it's a really simple example of it. Simple example of the, I think sometimes more modern, complicates the process in a sense. The complexity provided the so-called uncertainty, higher uncertainty. Higher uncertainty caused the so-called interdependency in a sense. You know what I mean? And one thing I knew about Haiti is they go through so many disasters each year, pretty much, from a hurricane to earthquake. Because of that, society is pretty decentralized. It doesn't interdependent much anymore. Hotels or any kind of business usually have the emergency generator system that works on almost daily basis, right? And now they're converting to the solar system because gas price went up so much. So using like a natural resource like a solar to kind of create this dependent system. If you're dependent, you don't rely on certain things. It does have a better impact sometimes. But anyway, I think the most important lessons we learned from over the years, we don't know what we don't know. I think that's the most important part of it. So we don't know what we're preparing for, but we can prepare for something, right? So we can prepare for the fitness in a sense. Fitness for emergency response structures, the assessment, to the tighten the ceiling, all those things. Make sure that don't trust engineers like me. You know what I mean? Think about engineers. We rewrite a building code every 3 to 5 years, right? Because of the new technology, new findings, new things happens, and now that this climate change is intensified and frequency is higher. That's why we have to kind of prepare for it. Something we don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Kit. I mean, two things struck me very strongly in this. One, of course, is the question of business interruption. Fine. Most systems are, at least many disaster response systems or even mitigation, is focused really on the capital infrastructure. We heard a lot about that. But in actual practice, it's a business interruptions in some senses, or the interruptions that happen in everyday life for poor people in poor countries that really define the overall risk framework. And I think, looking at it from that way in, sort of from outside in, is kind of very critical to deal with this kind of process, because economically, and you spoke about what happened in Fukushima, but the macroeconomic impact on Japan was, for an economy like Japan that's very used to this, was significant. It's just under 2%, and that's really big for a large economy of that scale. And it took a long time to respond and sort of come back to that. And the markets did even worse. So those are things that are, of course, there are interesting unintended consequences. I think Germany would not have taken the choice that it made of making the shift to renewables away from nuclear at that point of time if it were not for Fukushima in some cases. So sometimes you get things that are systemic that come from these processes that are there. So that's one thing that kind of really struck, and I think it's important for us to look at that, because we often forget the institutional and the economic and the social side of other processes. And the other question, of course, is knowing that we don't know a whole range of things. So preparing for uncertainty in a world that we know in which intensity and frequency of events, one of the sort of key things that was picked up last week in the global assessment of risk response was, so we're talking about 1.5 degrees as being the thing as far as climate is concerned. On the risk side, we're talking about trying to limit the number of events per day at below 1.5. because the projections until the 2030s is globally, we will have almost, anywhere between 1 and 1.5 events per day happening somewhere. So in a world that's increasingly interconnected, especially after COVID, we really have to watch out for stuff because of the teleconnections between that process. So with that, if I can hand over to Garima, because you work a lot on, on people and vulnerability and the social construction of risk, which kind of is the underlying process that we do need to address in some senses. Would you like to jump in? Can we have her presentation up? Yeah. So we just wait for a second.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm just starting to present. See my presentation.
Slide, you can make it full screen if you can. It will be nice.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, we can see it now. All yours.
I think I will definitely try and respond to many of these questions that I think Kit has raised and what Aruma, you were also talking about in this presentation. So I'm glad that I'm following up on this. I, of course, am also standing up for Andrew Masqueray, who couldn't make it because of all these uncertainties. And I think, I think partly the fact that we have these redundancies in place, we managed to do that. So he would have also liked to speak through this piece of work that we had done and published last year, where we looked at the social construction of systemic risk and trying to sort of build on case studies, drawing from case studies in the low and middle income countries from Zimbabwe, Uzbekistan, Colombia, Bangladesh, as well as one small island development nation, Dominica, to try and move and shift the gear from or reimagine the idea of systemic risk as we all have now come to understand, but to reimagine it in a way that something actionable can be done, to move from a more global sort of abstract idea, but to also think of what actions can really be taken to address and manage that kind of interconnected risk. So some of the traditional ways of understanding, of course, of understanding the systemic risk has been thinking about crises in a sequential way, how a hazard that affects one system produces cascades or nonlinear effects on other systems and across, and that happens across geographies. It can happen across time, over multiple sort of periods and even generations for that matter. Then we also understand failures in the form of synchronous failure, where breakdowns can happen in multiple systems at the same time, and the impacts are compounded. They're more, but also some sort of like simultaneous crises where risk is realized and multiple risks can be realized at the same time. And as you were talking about, Arma, like COVID, when COVID happened at the same time, it's not that other events had stopped happening. We were having floods, we were having droughts, and then places, and then there was the macroeconomic crisis. There were a whole bunch of things that were happening simultaneously, and then because of these interconnected systems, the impacts are often like greater than some of their parts. And one example of this, where all of these different forms have come together, just to illustrate, was the New York Hurricane Sandy, post Hurricane Sandy, how the storm surge affected, let's say, one system. So if it affected the electricity station, that further affected the healthcare facilities, it affected the telecommunication systems, it affected transportation and so on. But at the same time, it wasn't just the electricity system that it affected multiple, building, the built environment, it affected wastewater, it affected other kinds of built infrastructure as well. And then these direct and indirect effects together led to different kinds of, simultaneous crises, which had, in aggregate, had a long-term kind of an effect on not just New York, but also the greater area and also internationally to a very large extent. But the thing to understand here is that in traditional ways of understanding systemic risk, the focus has still been on the hazard. The focus has still been on this external trigger, which is causing this kind of ripple effect and causing these cascades of events. And what we intended to do and what we contended in this paper was to understand that risk itself is generated systematically. So it's not just that, it is not just the cascading non-linear impacts in the social and economic systems that are important in this, are captured in this idea of systemic, but also the idea of how the processes that lead to developing that risk and how that risk is accumulated within the systems. And one of the important aspect of that, of how that systemic risk is generated, is this idea of, or this trade-off that we're constantly dealing with. And I think Rebecca might at some point speak to it also, because it's like central to the political economy of the political economic question, the privatization of gains and socialization of risks. And with that, we mean that, how there's a constant sort of focus on protecting privatized gains, be it through financial systems, be it through strategic economic infrastructure, global supply chains, and so on, rather than actually focusing on broad-based, basic service delivery, or even to provide sort of some sort of safety nets which reduce the overall vulnerability of the people and the system and the environment as such. So that is one of the key ideas that we that constitutes to creating that risk and vulnerability in the system. And that then leads us to this idea that by understanding this, the understanding of how that risk is generated within the system, we can actually start thinking about what can be actionable for nations and for local stakeholders, what can be done at a local level, instead of just thinking about the interconnected nature of these global systems here. So we also then looked at different forms and different ways in which systemic risk can express itself, how it realizes. And then from there, we began to draw some kind of lessons for way forward. So as we've heard about all these different examples from Dr. Kate about systemic risk in interdependent infrastructure systems. And of course, the idea that some of the things that can be done is, of course, building some kind of redundancies, building some kind of flexibilities. And I think we've heard about this, but also this idea of a prospective risk, like prospective risk management is another way to think about it, that anything can go wrong within a unit, within the system, and to enable and to put in place risk assessments in advance, so that some actions can be taken prospectively. That to us was like an important thing that came up. Then systemic risk in global supply chains is another way where we've heard from all these different examples that, and we also learned from the case in Bangladesh, where urban risks, which were causing sort of fires within very locally, were affecting, let's say, supply chains and affecting the European textile markets and various other things. But over a long period of time and with a lot of deliberation, they came up with ways to address it through improving like accountability and compliance, and different kinds of stakeholders came together, private sector, and so on, and of course the government, and also locals, and including the labor unions. They came together to build some sort of like an accountability system to address that kind of a challenge. And over time now, they've definitely made a lot of progress in affecting this kind of systemic risk. We've also seen, as I was mentioning earlier, there are all these different kinds of simultaneous crises that are compounding from macroeconomic crises that because of the oil dependence that Sudan has, and compounded by COVID-19. There was also at the same time a conflict-driven refugee crisis that was happening. There was a drought, and that soon followed by floods, and then because of these extreme rains, there was an epidemic. So there were a whole bunch of different things that were happening. But at the core of it was the poor, it was the most vulnerable and the marginalized people in the community that were getting affected by all these things together. So the experience of compounded or simultaneous crisis was experienced at an individual, at a sort of household level. And partly some of the things that they tried to do was to develop some kind of community-based mechanisms for diversifying local economy. So to sort of reduce the dependence on just oil, and also improving the capacities to cope at the same time by doing so. Then I think this is one of the most challenging and probably the most urgent issue that we have at hand, which is the existential crisis in global systems. And I think climate is obviously, as we know, past information, as Arma, you were saying, is not enough for knowing what the future has entailed for us. And we've seen cases like the Aral Sea, where, of course, it has reduced dramatically, and it is not the issue of one country; it is an issue of an entire region, and the implications of what's going on in Aral Sea has international and very wide-ranging kind of issues as well. Dominica is another example where it's a small island, and post Hurricane Maria, it really multiple systems, and its existence of the island itself was dramatically questioned in this case. And some of the things that they have done is something that needs to be learned from. And so what the Aral Sea region has come up with, and the countries around in that neighborhood, they've come up with a long-term financially viable sort of territorial planning system and a trust fund. They've set up a trust fund to enable sort of long-term engagement with multiple sort of sectors. So it's not just environmental sustainability, but they're looking at food security, health, economic and social outcomes, but also how future donor-driven assistance can be made into more tangible and more actionable things. So that's a good example of how collaboration across boundaries is also coming together. And in the case of Dominica, they've got this all of government kind of framework that they're approaching, developing sort of national cross-sectoral strategies for resilience. So the idea is to build resilience at a very ground up level. And then I think one of the most sort of missed out aspect of systemic risk is that it is eventually experienced at a very everyday quotidian level. It is that risk of everyday losses, and the idea of extensive risk, which doesn't get captured, is the idea that the local everyday flooding actually entails much more, many more losses for people and for the system than, let's say, one-time extensive risk. So that then can be really achieved by focusing on the SDGs. I mean, the SDGs do give us a very strong framework to address these multiple kinds of issues related to infrastructure, good health and well-being, education, clean water, sanitation, housing, and so on. So various kinds of things that need to be addressed to actually start affecting systemic risk at that ground sort of level. So in sort of summary, I think there are 6 shifts that we proposed with this. That need to come into play by different actors, by different players at local, national, and regional governments, but also I think more in terms of sort of these global debates and understandings. So the first one, of course, is a very simple idea that we first need to improve the existing risk management systems. We don't even have enough risk management systems for addressing everyday risks, and that needs to be improved, and that will ultimately have a contribution and will ultimately affect interconnected systemic risks as well. So it has a very strong co-benefit right there. The other aspect is that there needs to be a shift from identifying hazard triggers, what is causing it, rather to understand the processes that generate that risk, and to then, by understanding, also addressing many of these processes of risk generation and vulnerability. And I think this is a more sort of bigger idea, that to say that shifting this gear from systemic risk governance to actually building more ground up sustainability, to think more broadly about building resilience. I think instead of sort of, this black swan event, these sort of catastrophic kind of trauma kind of framework, but to actually go towards a more, flourishing and, a wider development outcome kind of an approach. Would be the sort of a more sort of better way to address this idea of interconnected, long-term sustainable risk, sustainable development. And this, I think I've mentioned this before, but I think we still have a very strong focus on corrective and reactive responses, but to shift from there to prospective risk, to shift gears to anticipating what could go wrong and then build processes in place to address those. It could be through early warning systems, it could be through risk assessment frameworks, it could be better governance and so on. And all these then come together to actually shift us from this the idea of global phenomena, the fact that the world is globalizing and things are now, it seems like things are beyond our control, to actually build more capacities at the local level and build more strength at the territorial governance level is what we think is the root solution for addressing many of these systemic risks broadly. And I think shifting again from this idea of privatized gains to managing socialized risks is something that we definitely pitched for in this. But the last thought that I leave here with is that, that no infrastructure is safe unless all infrastructure is safe. So we need to recognize that, yes, things are interconnected, but each and by infrastructure here, I reflect back on what Aruma, you also said, that it's not just the asset, but also the service that the infrastructure provides. So that the asset and the service itself, all of them have to be ensured that they are sustainable, that they're resilient, to make sure that all the other interconnected infrastructures are safe and resilient at the same time. So I'll leave it at that, and happy to contribute further to this.
Go back to the previous slide, the slide before this for a second, because I think, there's a few, there are many things that were really useful here. I just pick up on a few points from this. The last point that's there, I think, is a very important point, because it leads, it's the way that our societies and our economic systems are organized. And I've seen this again and again over a long periods of time. We were just talking this before this, Kit and I, but a long time back, quarter century or more, when I was part of the UN team that went into Kobe after the Kobe earthquake in '95, at least the schema was that Japan is a society and a system that would have really built the resilience to enable this kind of process that was there. And it did in many ways, but there was a huge shock. And I still remember, because every time I go back to Japan, I go back to the same communities over the last 30 years or so. And the shock, and I'll give you the concrete example of that. There was a hospital in the center of one of the older coups in Kobe. And, it's a long city. Of course, it was a tremendous earthquake. It's also a port city. But through the long city, in the center, you had older buildings that were built in the 30s and the 40s, which were largely wooden buildings, traditional buildings, which were actually pretty good, because Kobe, at least in people's perception at that point of time, was more exposed to typhoons than to earthquakes. The seismologists knew that this is a tri-junction fault, but that was a dominant thing. So heavy roofs, a lot of wooden buildings, structures in between. And like in traditional Japanese cities, everything was organized around the square. There used to be, in the old days, at least large tanks where you had water. This came from the experience of the Tokyo earthquake, which went back further. So if there was a fire there, you'd go out, take buckets, or you'd pump from there and you'd deal with the fire. Now, unfortunately, there was gas pipelines running in the middle of the city. And so apart from the buildings that took place, the gas pipelines ruptured, there were tremendous fires that were burning. And the challenge, of course, and I still remember this very clearly, that in that hospital there, they had to deal with a large number of chemical and burn injuries, right? And what happened? There was no power. But most critical, when you're, all of us who've dealt with triage at that point of time, there was no water. So in day 2, effectively, there was a bucket brigade, and Kobe is a very narrow city where young people were actually physically carrying buckets of seawater from the water, from the sea edge, and bringing it up, so the doctors could actually operate and handle emergency surgeries at that point of time. So I'm giving you, one interesting example. This was a long time back. And Japan has changed dramatically. That earthquake changed Japan's view of this thing. It created Hyogo, and then from that came Sendai, and we're all sort of beneficiaries of Sendai. But I'm just saying, just in that small event that were there, the burning that took place, the interconnection between the systems is a very real process. But the fact is, the land market was the key driver that enabled a lot of these processes, and those tanks were no longer there because they had been built on, fine. And you had high-rise buildings along with other stuff, because Kobe was known as Kobe Inc. at that point in time, a very aggressive city. So effectively, even in a very advanced economy, which is very, very sensible and was thinking ahead as far as risk was concerned, you found a very clear privatization of the gains and a socialization of the risks. And, you know, Haiti is such a classic example. Pretty much in most parts of the world, we've seen this again and again, whether we talk about what happened in Nepal or in this part of the region, etc. So that's one thing that I think we really have to look for, because irrespective of the infrastructure systems, if you're going to have a socialization of risk, the risk governance and the risk response and mechanisms are not good in many parts of the world. This is going to be a dramatic problem. It's going to cascade, and the social impacts are going to be much higher. The second thing that I think was very important in what you were saying is this question of moving from systemic risk governance, which is an interesting and important thing that we've finally moved to in the international space, to governing for sustainability and resilience. So the SDGs are a framework. They're also a network in some senses. But the challenge is, when we negotiated the SDGs and we negotiated Sendai in parallel between 2013 and 15, these were running on two different tracks. So if you look at the SDG framework, it is very weak on risk. So this is one thing, I'm trying to reach out to the community here and say, look, if we're going to be talking about interconnected systems, then in the next revision, which we will hopefully see over the next 2 or 3 years, in countries, and of course in the international system, the global platform is opening in 3 weeks' time. We really need to look at how we integrate risk inside each of those goals, whether it's 8 or 3, or that's health systems or even education. We need to integrate risk into that framework, because if it's not integrated, then exactly what Kit was saying would happen. You look at what's happening in front of you, you won't look at stuff that's outside that. And finally, this is just a personal reflection. We assume in many cases that we're living in a world in which everything will eventually come to equilibrium, either is at equilibrium or will come to equilibrium. And we design for that. Engineers kind of work with that, and we use statistics to do that kind of stuff. The fact is that the world, much of the world, is always very far from equilibrium. Poor people certainly are far from equilibrium all the time. That's what vulnerability is about, fine? But even other parts of the world very quickly can move into far from equilibrium circumstances. So I think one of the questions for what we're dealing with just now is interconnections is, how do you manage interconnected systems which are going to be significantly far from equilibrium, fine? How does one design systems for that? So you can take the traditional route and says, okay, split them up and build lots of redundancy. But many parts of the world can't do that. So either that redundancy becomes residual risk that sits with individuals or firms or whatever it is, or we have to think of other ways of trying to address this question. So that's a bit of a provocation, I think, to the audience and people outside. I think that's where we need to go to. And I think from that, maybe if I can ask Graham for you to come in, because in some senses the air transportation system is one of the best sort of human design systems that we have. It's a very risky business, but if you look at the aggregate risk of crossing a road in many parts of the world, it's probably much higher than flying in an aircraft. So the industry has done dramatic things over the last many decades, but in some senses you were caught off guard by a whole range of things in the last 2 decades. 9/11, at one end, and then of course what's happened in COVID. You couldn't have prepared for that. But as we move forward, what are your experiences, and what would you say about how we can deal with these kind of questions of building resilience, in these systems, and what kind of governance frameworks and policy frameworks can be brought into place to deal with the questions of interdependence? Because yours is one of the most powerful networks that connect to the world. It transferred COVID from Wuhan to other parts of the world in a very, very efficient manner in a few weeks' time. Let's put it that way. Sorry, that was being facetious, but...
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation. I think COVID has shown us a few things. I think firstly, I'll come back to it in a second, the human component of the way we respond. And there are some human factors in in disaster and interconnected systems that perhaps haven't been fully considered in the past. I think you highlight 2 points, the role of aviation in an interconnected system and being able to actually transfer the ripples as a medium for sharing disruption. And it's not unique to aviation. I think you could take the same and we could apply it to other forms of other utilities which connect things together. But it's a good reference point. I think the other thing we see is actually the role of the system, in this case aviation, in also being able to help respond to and mitigate. And what we've seen is, whilst passenger traffic has pretty much ceased in many parts of the world for a period of time, we've had to find ways of keeping the cargo that sits in the, historically in the belly of aircraft, a passenger aircraft, moving, because it's playing an absolutely essential role in the recovery, whether it's moving protective equipment, whether it's moving vaccines or keeping the supply of food moving around the world. So it's a really good example, I think, of that interconnected system, both of the consequence and the effect. I think if I look at a system level perspective, one of the challenges is to what extent the different agents in the system actually understand and address the interdependencies. And I think if I look through purely from a UK perspective, and this isn't an aviation unique lens, that if you go back probably 15 years, I would say that there wasn't necessarily a joined up view of how we looked at the resilience of critical national infrastructure. And systemically over the last 10, 15 years, there have been progressive moves. For example, a requirement for adaptation reporting at a sector level, recognizing historically that has been much more sector than cross-sector perspective focused. But what we're seeing from a policy perspective is recognizing that we do need to start looking at interconnected solutions. So the UK now has an infrastructure operators adaptation forum, which is moving forward in that way of people sharing ideas. Recognizing that we haven't gone far enough at a national level. So if you look at the Committee for Climate Change, what they were saying in their report in 2021 is that we still need to go further in having a systemic national assessment in terms of how we plan and address risk, and there are some movement on strategic actions. But I think that gives an example of the role of governments or collective governments in putting structures together. So that actually we need to draw out and create frameworks within which people can look at the interdependencies. The Canadian system's got an example where the Canadian government's created a framework, a critical infrastructure interdependency model that helps people look at what the plays are. I think if we look at aviation globally, there's a role that the groups like organizations like ICAO, and then both at the airline level, IATA and ACI can play in actually developing standards. As we've looked at specifically in response to COVID, the role of those sort of international organizations in trying to drive towards standards, as we've looked at, said, how do we respond to COVID? How do we create new standards? How do we get common approaches to allowing people to move, mutual recognition of different standards, different approaches, whether it's for screening, whether it's for use of masks, whether it's for air quality in aircraft, start creating a framework in which we can try and get the overall network to move forward as opposed to individual parts of it moving in isolation. So I think for me, there's an element of saying there's a role of the government, the regulators, both national and international, to create frameworks that help the individual agents within the system to say, what are our interdependencies? How are we responding to them? And do it in a way that we try and step away from the individual interest in the network to say, how do we look at it at a system and a systems level?
So, I mean, just follow up on that quickly, Graham. I'm just wondering, so like I said, aviation is a really very sophisticated industry, but the supply chains or the processes you're talking about are as strong as the weakest link in the chain.
Yes.
So while you can have really high quality standards in, let's say, in Europe and the UK and stuff like that, if you have an operator in another part of the world which is not subject to some of the processes, and that's going to happen, I guess, in many parts of the world, fine. How does one actually manage for resilience across, because this is a global industry, fine, across all geographies? And then how does one enable the learning that happens very quickly? For example, there was a big controversy for a long period of time about whether masks are really useful or not, as far as transmission was concerned in COVID. And that's something that has to be implemented and managed at airports and inside aircraft and things like that. So how does one get to learn adequately apart from the standards? The standards are good, but we know the standards are as good as they are implemented or sort of measured up to in particular parts of the world. So while individual countries can do this quite effectively, in an interconnected world, there may be some serious challenges in trying to make that happen, and eventually takes the industry down.
It's an important point. I think there's probably a follow-through conversation actually at a national and organisational level that's perhaps worth following on to in a moment. But I think in terms of the international level, actually, I think the way that some of the multinational organisations, ICAO, IATA and ACI have come together in response to COVID has been actually really impressive. So I think we're very fortunate in aviation in the ICAO as an agency of the UN, going back to the Chicago Convention, does actually provide a global forum for setting standards. And one of the challenges of multinational forums of that nature is that they require consensus across the globe. And actually, there are a wide, for very good reasons, a wide range of different objectives and requirements and priorities in that sort of forum. But I think what we've seen, certainly to my mind, is in response to COVID, there has been at quite pace for an international group an approach to saying what is our view to air quality on aircraft, what's our approach to standards, how do we encourage national governments to move towards some common approaches. It's taken a little bit of time, but actually in the nature of international movement, I think it's been pretty quick. I think one of the advantages of ICAO is it does have a mandating perspective as well, that when ICAO set standards that actually become global mandates and have then to be taken forward at regional level, so from a European perspective, ECAC, EASA, implement things, and then national civil aviation authorities. So it does have an ability, but either as a setting the rules or in setting best practice. I think it's been really useful, and it's been, again, in this instance, I think we've seen fantastic collaboration between ICAO, the airline and the airport bodies to say we've actually got common cause in this, and we've seen real harmony. One thing I think is interesting from that is the ICAO Assembly is coming up later this year, and in the context of the wider conversation earlier in movement towards net zero, that the burning platform for us in helping mitigate climate change as opposed to respond to it is what we're going to do around things like sustainable aviation fuels and decarbonisation of aviation. So I think we should be looking to the same elements of how do we use the ICAO Assembly to say we want to move towards at least a minimum level of standard, and as importantly some aspirations, as we may not all be able to agree the same target date, but we can agree a common direction of travel. And again, I think the role of the multinational institutions in agreeing is that whilst we can't all agree it's 2050, 2060, 2070, we can all agree that we have a direction of travel, we have shared aspirations, and that we'll work towards the same end. So I think if we come back to that applicability in terms of interdependence of systems, we can set some common aspirations. We can say here's some ways of addressing it, even if we don't. If I'm an airport in a developing world environment, I may operate at a different pace, and I may apply I may not go as far down the journey, but at least I'm using the same taxonomy, I'm applying the same principles, and actually recognize that in some markets we're seeing some of the emerging airports, some of the emerging airlines being as good, if not better, than some of the ones in the established ones. So I think having that framework that says we can be good wherever we are in the world, we don't have to necessarily have to say some bits of the world are systemically better than others. That there are great examples, and those forums actually allow us to share examples. So we say, this airline in this territory is delivering best practice in this area, and we pick it up and say we can all learn from it.
Exactly, that's a really good point. In some senses, I think this is what CDRI is trying to do, and I'm glad that you pointed out that with both IATA and ICAO, there's an opportunity of bringing this, in some senses, in many of the sort of emerging markets, you have better air quality, air infrastructure than in other places, because you're building them now in the 21st century rather than retrofitting something that was built in the 1960s or 70s. So there's a great opportunity there. But I'm glad that you made the connection to net zero, because that's absolutely the right time to bring in Rebecca, because Rebecca is really sort of working on this question, on questions of the political economy of investment, of how does one bring in climate concerns into a whole range of processes, especially on the institutional side and the stakeholder interest side. So Rebecca, I guess over to you, and how we can try and sort of integrate the climate and the disaster risk agenda.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to attend today. Yes, I want to speak a little bit about the climate, but also I think picking up on what some of the other speakers have said about thinking a little bit more holistically about what we mean by resilience. So we talk a lot about the need to build climate resilience, But I think also we need to take a step back and also to understand that it's actually a lot of our sort of previous socioeconomic development trends that are now interacting with each other to create these new threats, climate change being a good example of that. But also, many of these threats are not new. And I think, Bill Gates gave a talk in 2015, a TED talk about, why we are not ready for the next pandemic. So it's not just about confronting these threats such as climate change or COVID, but it's also about understanding how they materialize and metastasize. And I think this is where our understanding of kind of a more political economy, or what ODI calls a risk-informed development approach, needs to be considered. No development can be entirely risk-free. And also our socio-economic development choices can and often do increase the vulnerability and exposure to harm of both natural and human systems. And we heard that from the first speaker, I think, in terms of that engineering decision about the height of the wall. So I think what we really need to be thinking about is decision makers needing to understand and acknowledge that all development choices involve trade-offs. So rather than enhancing resilience, some of these choices and the trajectories are actually reducing people's ability to take advantages of opportunities arising in society, etc. So really, when we think about managing the risks, whether it's in infrastructure or more broadly in society, we need to think about, when we say the word resilience, it's so often used in our communities of practice. But resilience against what? I often say to my team, but resilience to what? What risks are we most concerned about? And this is actually where we need to again think about taking a bit of a political economy approach. We're talking now then about risk preferences. So who gets to decide on those risk priorities? And what is considered a risk or an opportunity to whom, and how it should be appraised and treated, is a very value-laden judgment. So what is perceived as risky, it just can't be separated from political and psychological and cultural and financial contexts in which decisions are made. So, for example, politicians might prioritize or de-emphasize certain risks, or may even withdraw support for certain risk management processes of their predecessors. And then what is it we want to be resilient to? Which infrastructure? What is it linked or connected to, that infrastructure? For example, if we're focusing on water infrastructure, then in addition to water infrastructure, we also need to focus on the resilience of water resources, users, and concerned institutions. So which institutions are responsible for managing the risks across the board? And who is it we want to be resilient? The infrastructure or the people? Probably both, but though the approaches to managing that resilience are quite different. So in that thinking, who is the poorest, the most vulnerable? Have we taken their needs into consideration? And then who will build the resilience? Which actors, which institutions? So this is about really thinking about who bears the responsibility for managing that risk. And I think we see a lot in the climate resilience space, that often the responsibility for managing that risk can often be put too much on the local communities. So sort of managing independent risks in infrastructure, I think, must really start with applying these risk-form approaches, understanding the intersections, understanding the risk preferences, and understanding the trade-offs. And this is because, for me, in infrastructure, it's much more than the physical infrastructures. It's really about what connects. It's about what connects people. Infrastructure connects people with their livelihoods, with essential services. And this is so important, in a changing climate. And we're seeing that the risk and severity of infrastructure service disruptions, and this is what we think about a lot, what that means for those people who have services disrupted. this potential increase is due to the complexity, as we've heard, of these modern critical infrastructures. We heard from the first speaker again about using the Haiti example, where it was things were much more decentralized. So disasters and climate risks, are testing the resiliency of both the physical infrastructure, but also of the communities, of the governance structures. And it might seem, an obvious statement, but I think what is not often reflected upon is that when disruptions in infrastructure services happen, they tend to have significant impacts on the lives and livelihood of the poorest and most vulnerable, but they are not perhaps always considered. And this is, I think, because in the development and sort of climate sectors, we tend to talk about communities, but communities are not monolithic. There's diversity in them. There's diversity of gender, disability, ethnicity, and so on. And these groups have different levels of resilience. So we need to think about how these disruptions are disproportionately affecting communities, such as women, etc. So we really need a much better understanding of who is affected and what way. Is it long-term, short-term impacts, etc. And I think this is why when we're thinking about the climate resilience approaches, perhaps moving away from these more conventional engineering approaches and asking, we need to have this multi-hazard approach. And I know that term is used a lot, but we need an approach that better accounts for the interlinkages between the social, economic, and the environment and climate risk. So again, I think that means putting the well-being of people at the center, for example, of infrastructure planning. So that's what would truly a climate resilient infrastructure would look like, an approach that considers minimizing the impacts of disasters on these different subgroups, and would ensure that investments actually can produce environmentally sustainable and multi-hazard approaches, and fundamentally understanding how infrastructure disruptions affect the well-being of people, and how that then contributes to social inequality and poverty. And really, I suppose my last point is that combining and incorporating these climate and management approaches with forward-looking social environmental risk management is where you could get some of those big wins. So that when we're focusing on the infrastructure development, it's not just about a tick box exercise for ESG standards or other compliance. We actually see some practical impacts on the ground.
So yeah, just a quick follow-up on that for you, Rebecca. Most, or even now, in spite of all of the debate on this question, most infrastructure investment decisions are kind of driven by cost-benefit kind of approaches. Now, what I hear you saying is, but we do cost-benefit now with multiple hazards. So, there's a wider hazard spectrum, but what I hear you saying is a stronger focus on the multiple forms of vulnerability at one end, but also focusing on well-being and prosperity as outcomes, fine. And that's why things like the SDGs are actually quite useful. The question is, there are frameworks for assessment and hence for governance. We'll have to shift from straightforward cost-benefit and, we do synergies and trade-offs, but they're very often in economic terms. You have to deal with social questions, you have to deal with economic questions, with equity questions inside that. And isn't that a bit too much, or do you think ESG is moving in that direction? Because at least ESG investment that's coming in the climate space is starting to ask these hard questions about, equity, climate justice, and also questions of well-being and livelihoods. So how does one sort of bring this into this interconnected kind of world of hard infrastructure that uses certain metrics?
Yeah, and I think it's important that we're not naive. Companies, I'm very cognizant of the fact that the businesses, it is about cost benefit. They have shareholders. They have to make a profit. So it's not about saying to companies, you need to take on the responsibility of government and create all these social goods. But actually, I don't think it's unrealistic for business, to work with government. I think ESG is going in the right direction, but I think there is still some challenges there. I think we can see still a little bit of box ticking. Also, I think one of the concerns that we have a little bit is that we might be seeing a strong focus on the E, on the environmental, but perhaps not such a stronger focus on the S and the G. And by just simply focusing on the environmental, one can also then embed risk, create risks in the social and governance. And actually, I think what would be a really strong push in terms of ESG is to absolutely avoid greenwashing with it, but also to see that process as being much more integrated. Whereas at the moment, I think the ESG frameworks are quite isolated. It's siloed themselves. So that is, I think, creating some problems. We did a project on a road in Kenya, and there was a strong focus on the environmental impacts because there's obviously lots of compliance that had to be made. But then there wasn't so much consideration of the broader climate resilience issues in terms of if you make the culvert, bigger or whatever, actually you're going to create some potential displacement of flooding to a community down the road. They were actually using as well mostly historical climate data for this, but also not considering as well that some of the changes with the road and what it meant for the water resources, even though the groundwater access had been created, it actually meant that the women who were then going to collect the water were having to do an extra mile on the journey and so on. So I think, again, it's about thinking a bit more holistically about these things.
Thanks. So, Kit, if I can bring this back to you. So, what I heard, and I saw Graham also kind of nodding to that, is that at least in private sector investment, which is driving a lot of infrastructure at the moment, there's an interest in looking at, let's say, the E side significantly, and less on the S and the G. So, in your experience of looking at risk governance, especially with interconnected systems, do you see an opportunity there? That's kind of first question. The second one is more provocative, and that is that are there certain kinds of infrastructures that are best controlled and managed in a sense for the public good or in public purpose, rather than being completely opened up and in certain contexts than being just sort of run by private corporations. So what's your experience of that? Because you've seen lots of extreme events.
Well, I think disaster recovery response, preparedness, best practice is where the community-driven, local-driven, family-driven, individual-driven. For example, let me get back to 2011 Tohoku tsunami in Japan. I want to hear the beat. I'm Japanese here, by the way. They're one of the most prepared people,
Absolutely.
But let me tell you bad and good on that one. So earthquake happened, right? Tsunami came through, and remember I told you about the rail station shut down, so no rails, and the airport got flooded, right? No airport, no rail. And Japanese government decided to, in its per response policy, to have more the freeway system only for emergency response. Pretty noble idea, right? You don't create any plug up and stuff like that. But what happened there is, so no rail, no highway, no airport. How are we going to get like normal things, food and goods to go to the places, right? To people. So if I was there. If you go to store, there's nothing in there because there's no way to get to. No food, nothing. But Japanese people just fine. You know why? Because they know that kind of things happen, right? Because Japan is exposed so much of disasters. Everybody has 2 weeks of food, fuel, water. So no problems, So it could be disastrous. Secondary disaster could be huge. Many people could be starving, but that didn't happen there. So I think that really the kind of that community-driven, local-driven thing, I think that's really critical to dislodge this inner dependency of disaster cascade effect per se.
That's the way. So what I hear you saying is that we have to count on building community resilience across the world. Yeah. Some cultures are better at doing this. Of course, even when you have community resilience, you have to keep on doing it. And that's why Japan is remarkable. I mean, every school that I've seen in Japan, from kindergarten onwards, that's there happening literally every week. So otherwise, you lose contact with these kind of processes. But separately from that, you do need infrastructures. And some infrastructures are very expensive to build, some are less expensive to build. So the question then is, where does the responsibility, or where does the mix of responsibility sit to be able to build and manage these large infrastructures? Some of them are regional. As we go to larger and larger ships, which there will be 24 ports across the world that can take them. You're building a system that is going to be less resilient than it would be if you had 100 ports. Fine, that's kind of pretty obvious in some senses. Fine, it creates inequalities in some sense. So how does one keep the balance between the need for interconnectedness in the world, no doubt about that, and the fact that there will be extreme events? Most of the system is far from equilibrium a lot of the time. How does one keep the balance? What are the heuristics that one would use to try and manage that, whether it's earthquakes or it was typhoons or pandemics? What's your sense of that?
I think you just have to, like we did at the LIX study, just have to remove the certain thing goes away. So what's going to replace by it? I think that type of thought process, it's all come down to disasters. Question was like, can we predict a disaster look like? I came to the conclusion you cannot predict, because just so much of this interdependency and the cascade effects, just that the policy making, all the things intertwined together.
Yeah, these are complex systems. So they'll have emergent behaviors, and many of the behaviors you can't really you can't control them. So that hard control systems may be useful for some things, but not for others.
Right.
That's what I'm hearing from you. Yeah. Garima, do you want to come in here and sort of reflect on that? Because I think Andrew and you were talking a lot about dealing with systemic risk and connecting it to resilience and development. So any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would definitely say is that, disasters, so to say, are also in the form of like they open a window of opportunity. I mean, which is what we're seeing right now with COVID. A lot of we've now learned the hard way. We've learned the hard way that there's lots of systems which are really not working. I mean, our health systems are really weak. We know, and we've known that. It's not news to us suddenly. It's just that COVID has now really opened up all these debates and then put them up front. And I think that is an opportunity, and the time that we are in, where we can actually start thinking about what are these different, what were these different factors of within development that really fell apart in this context, and I think where we need to make the investments. And yes, of course, I mean, it is still a big question. Who is going to make that investment? Who is going to take the leadership, and who is going to actually make sure that happens, and where does the accountability sit? And I think that those questions are definitely difficult, but at least we have that now at play. We know that these are things that need investments. So I think that is a very significant kind of a shift, and I think we should make use of this kind of an opportunity and this window that has opened up, which connects different forms and different forms of development, which cut across different sectors, to say that risk is eventually inherent in the idea of lack of development. Wherever there is lack of development is where we see risk exposure or risk intensifying, and the losses experienced at that. So I think there's a question of equity there. There's a question of distributional justice alongside, how this, even if some investments are made in different kinds of development frames, but who benefits from it, and who bears the cost and who benefits. I think those are definitely questions we don't. Those will be debates that we need to put forward. Yeah.
Thanks. Rebecca, if I can come back to you in a second. I'm just wondering if there's anybody in the audience here who would like to come in and sort of has a question for the panel. Yes, please. To the gentleman there, could we have, do you need a mic or, thanks so much. Could you introduce yourself for a second, please?
I'm Sanjay Agarwal, and I'm Deputy Director General Disaster Management with Ministry of Communications. So my question is that, yes, in power sector and telecom sector, there are many private players. And it is really very difficult to create a resilient infrastructure meeting the requirement of cyclonic requirements in the coastal area and all that, because it involves a huge cost. And in Indian scenario, the telecom companies are already under financial stress. So even for alert dissemination kind of small thing, if they don't have a technology, it is really very difficult to bring them on platform to implement those technology issues involving just investment of say 200 crore rupees. But it is a big thing for them today. So how to go ahead with that? Of course, there are licensing provisions. We can coerce them, we can force them, but since the industry is in financial stress, so that is something I just wanted to.
No, good question. There's a lady in the front there, and I think the gentleman at the back. We'll just pool the questions, and then we'll have the panel come back. Can we just give it to the, yeah.
Thank you very much, Arumar. I'm Rita Misal. I work with UNDP. Thank you very much for listening to these eminent panelists. And I think my question goes around to what Rebecca was saying, and I would like to come back to the question about putting people's well-being at the center. And if you haven't learned any lessons, then COVID-19 has taught us that. You know, we took infrastructure out of the equation when we did our assessments as well. For the last 2 years, we're talking only about the social and economic impact on people's lives. And then we look at how infrastructure supported or did not support that. You know, and so the question is that how do we get back governments to think about that way? What happened in COVID-19 was not about transport or power disruption or road disruption or, you know, that was the impact of the pandemic, you know, the supply chain disruption and things like that. So how do we get governments to think about what are the key factors that we need to get back for the governments to think about resilience of people, of communities, through different systems, you know, building that stack of things that people have choices to lean back on so that they are not dependent on something coming from China or something coming from America or some chip coming from Thailand for them to survive, you know. So what is it that we can, as a panel here, propose? Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's somebody at the back, and then we'll close and open the questions out to the panel. Can we just, yeah, thank you so much. Sorry.
Thank you. I'm Sarabjit from UNICEF. Towards somewhere in between, I thought you guys refrained from calling out on the very old practices of emergency management. Mm-hmm. And I think there was a clear sort of consensus that interlinkages between various hazards and consequences will not be handled. We will require efficient emergency management services. So is disaster resilient infrastructure going to include emergency management services? Are you going to call down on them, or is it part of your agenda? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we got three very interesting questions there. One on the telecom sector, one really on how we integrate this stuff. Rebecca, would you like to come in? I think at least one and a half or two of the questions were directed, I think, in your direction. So would you like to come in first and make your earlier point that you, yeah.
Oh yeah, great. Yeah, no, on my earlier point, I just wanted to reiterate this point about we need to really understand some of the trade-offs in our decisions. So and this is a bit linked also, I think, to the well-being point, is that when we are, for example, developing climate mitigation solutions, that we might be saying, right, we're going to think about hydro power, we're going to be thinking about putting in micro solar fields in certain areas. But what we are not then necessarily doing is understanding what some of the trade-offs might be. You know, are we creating maladaptation? So I think particularly in the case of some of these sort of solar fields that have been developed in some parts of Africa. So they've been there to obviously create power generation urgently needed. But the problem is these are then placed in potentially contested lands. They're placed in pastoralist corridors. So you're actually then creating conflict risk, because the issues around land rights and land tenure, which is the underlying vulnerabilities, are not first and foremost addressed. And I think that also speaks to the how do you put well-being of people at the centre. I think what we tend to do is that the different communities involved, and by communities I mean maybe UN agencies, World Bank, businesses, governments, actually we think we're having a dialogue with each other, but we're not actually. We're not taking that first step of really understanding what are the decision-making priorities. What does managing the risk mean to us? What do we, as those individual constituents, see as the priority risks? And actually what we will find is that they are quite different. And this is what is going back to my earlier point of understanding the risk preferences and the risk tolerances. So the risk preferences for the government will be quite different. It might be around, what's vote winning or whatever. Civil society will be quite different. And what we actually need to come together on is a bit of a convergence and a bit of a shared understanding. We will never get complete agreement, but what it will do is enable us to stress test some of these policies that are potentially being proposed, understand some of those trade-offs, but most importantly, it will be about, and I think this was the last speaker's point, whose responsibility is it to manage the risk? I mean, it's not really McDonald's responsibility, who've maybe built the bridge or built the airport, then to manage the disaster response if something goes wrong. Yes, they're a stakeholder, but where does that responsibility lie? And I think we need to get back to basics and start to ask some of these questions. What do you understand by the risk? And who's going to manage it?
Thanks. Graham, any responses to some of the questions? Any sort of concluding thoughts? Sorry, I think we need you to switch on.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Two quick thoughts. I think in terms of the finance one, I think there is an element that says increasingly institutions are looking at the need for green finance and socially responsible finance. I think that will become more critical. To the earlier point, I'm not sure that it makes a difference who is investing in the infrastructure, whether it's public or private, because actually public sector investment can be as disjointed or as coordinated as private sector when it's done well or badly. I think it's more about creating the framework in which it's done. Some of that is about understanding minimum standards, and then actually in a regulatory structure, do we set the right standards? But more importantly, do we have the flexibility in regulation to adapt that says the world has changed? Using the same tariff structure when we want to incentivize different behaviors doesn't work. So in the context of a telco that is struggling to provide services because it's been impacted because its cost base has changed, to what extent do we actually need to change the charging structure? I think so. There's an element of saying we need the flexibility in the regulation. I think we also need to understand the value of what's happening. So yeah, it's great to say polluter pays as an underlying principle, but actually we then need to say, well, where is the benefit from this, and who should be paying for that? If there's significant social benefit from something that is supporting particular communities, to what extent do we then say we change the regulatory structure, we change the tax environment, we perhaps give tax relief that or we don't impose new taxes, or we impose taxes in the right way to drive the right outcomes, that says if this is benefiting communities, then we allow people to do it at a better return. If it's bad behavior and it's hurting certain communities, then actually the tax structure may drive us the other way. So it's about creating regulatory models that align the outcomes with what works for our social outcomes, our environmental outcomes, and not just economic return. I think to the point Rebecca made briefly earlier, I personally don't see design of infrastructure can be isolated from social outcome. That if we're designing a bridge, we need to be, you design a bridge to connect communities, not to design a bridge. It has a purpose, it has a social purpose as well as an economic purpose. And in designing it, as a responsible designer, we should be thinking about how it's used as well as what it is. I think that plays back a little bit to the point from UNICEF about engaging emergency services, how we operate. We should be thinking about not just the physical response, but how it's used. What are the operational responses to change? What are the different levers? If things go wrong, what are the ways in which they can be used? And how do we structure that in a way that it's not tied to, this is the only way, these are the set of processes you have to follow? you have some processes that give a framework, but you create a collaborative environment to respond to it. So I can plan for what I do know, but I have to have a system that can adapt to the things I don't. I see our role as an infrastructure designer being to think about how infrastructure is used and how it's operated, as opposed to just saying it's a great bridge.
Yeah, thanks. No, that makes absolutely good sense. Kit, any responses to the questions? And
I think one thought is there's a myth out there providing the resiliency is too expensive. I don't think it's true. I mean, let's say that if you make a perfect job to make this resilient to certain, say, telecom system, say hurricane, take, say, $100 to make it, all confirmation. First dollar spent on, that's actually a huge impact for direct loss. Huge impact. So just doing some really weak links of a system makes a huge impact. And not only just direct loss control, but control the actually recovery process. Kind of talking about ADB and stuff like that, right? Those, how actually response is done, recovery is done, that's actually really almost like a free to do, make a huge impact in a resiliency index, you know? So that's my kind of thought about that.
okay, thanks. Garima, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond, I think, to maybe briefly to all three questions. I think the first one, I would agree also with Kit that, you know, the investments made in resilience are not necessarily as high as the returns are. So, and when there is an incentive for the private sector where they see that there is an outcome where there are benefits in the long term, there would be at least some kind of an agreement to actually start investing. And we've seen that as an example in Bangladesh after the fires in private textile sort of factories, and how that started affecting the investment process. I think that really is an example to rely on. The other thing I would also say is that, you know, we've heard from other speakers about like regulation as being one of the ways to address many of these challenges. But I think we also know that while it's normally effective to do that in high income countries, it's not so much, you know, it's not as much a tool in low and middle income countries where the governance frameworks themselves are fairly weak. In that case, there are other forms in which the other sort of levels in which action needs to be taken. One is, of course, to invest more in institutional frameworks for risk governance, first of all, before, you know, relying on developing regulations, because we need some implementing capacities also. And that includes emergency systems, as you know, the gentleman asked that question, that it is not that we don't want emergency systems, it is that we don't want only emergency systems. We need more than just emergency. I think that's what the point that we want to take away from here. And I think, and the other aspect is that there is a certain amount of implicit risk governance that exists across with individuals, with households, with businesses, and that kind of an informal sort of not written rules of risk governance, and that's something that needs to be understood better and to be incentivized more. I think that's another way of scaling it up. So I'll just close at that. I know we're running short of time.
Good, thanks. I mean, you know, I just want to try and see whether we can close more or less on time. Just a few sort of closing reflections. The first is that we're going to see a lot more infrastructure being built for a very simple reason, that a lot of people in the world don't actually have good services. So in some senses, one of the best ways to increase resilience, like Kit was saying, was just to make sure the services are available. Whether it's emergency services at one end, or basic services at another end, or even, let's say, in high-income countries, you know, there's huge inequality in service access. So it's not as if there's inequality, you know, no lack of inequality that we've seen there, especially during COVID. So I would say raising the floor everywhere in terms of infrastructure and services is something that we need to do universally. And some countries will need to do retrofits, and others will need to do new builds, and some in others in between will need to do that kind of stuff. So infrastructure is going to build out. There's no question about it. It's absolutely central in the post-COVID regime. Even a country like India, like you've seen, we are making massive investments as part of an economic recovery plan. So hopefully that will create jobs simultaneously and have some other social impacts along with that. And Europe is going with a strong commitment to the Green New Deal. I'm not so sure that all of the new things that is going to happen are going to be very resilient, but that's a fact that's sort of under debate at the moment. And the US is going through its own challenges in this space of trying to get legislation and investment through that does this kind of stuff. And other parts of the world have different sets of challenges in some ways, including what China is doing in the overbuilding in some bits and sort of underbuilding in others. So that's, I guess, one relatively clear fact. Now, the fact is, as more and more modern infrastructures are going to be built, they're going to be interconnected, partially because of digitalization, partially because there's interconnection of supply chains. That's the way a lot of the world is currently going, and I don't think that's going to change very much. That will put, like Rebecca was saying, that will put a lot of people at risk because of emergent maladaptation or risk kind of aggregation that will happen in those infrastructures if we don't do them sensibly. If we don't look at who's going to gain, who's going to lose, if you're not able to look at the regulatory frame and what the social outcomes or the economic outcomes are, which, and again, it doesn't always happen, fine, because each of us or each of these stakeholders in this room are looking at their particular interests. So, if a firm is going to look at quarter-on-quarter returns, and that's how they're going to be measured, they're obviously going to be imperatives to make that happen. So I think there are some deep systemic challenges that are there where we have to look at how risk governance and its attribution and its unbundling need to actually take place quite carefully, because this cascading will happen unless you're able to unbundle and contain the risk transfer in some senses. Eventually, it's like any other kind of system. Eventually, it will sit with the households at the bottom of the system, because there's nothing in between to be able to reorganize it and enable risk transfer. And we've seen with COVID, even the reinsurance companies are in deep trouble, because it's sort of it was not imagined that this level of risk would actually cascade economically and build up as far as that's concerned. So we need to certainly look at that. But my own sense is we do need to like Graham was saying, look at the regulatory frames and how they're organized and reoriented. And that's where I think the question of risk governance is, because national governments or even different sets of markets have very different regulatory environments. So you can't apply a one-size-fits-all as far as that's concerned. And I think exploring what has been done interestingly in some places and building that up and trying that out in other places might be an interesting thing. This is, I think, an important conversation for CDRI to pick up, because some of the most interesting innovations I've seen have actually come from places that are really pushed to the corner, like you said in Haiti. People are remarkable in their ability, and governments also respond sometimes most effectively to extreme crisis, as do industries. So, we really need to be able to exchange experiences, try and abstract core concepts that need to be put together, and then try and apply them in particular places. And in that, I think the real challenge for us is to try and make sure that we don't sort of take all the value and concentrate the value in particular sets of institutions and people, and let the risks then cascade to everybody else. And that's a hard question. That's, in a sense, a deep political economy question. The industry is not really organized to try and look at this, and that's where I think that international dialogue or dialogue within country between sectors is really important, because it can't be done by any individual actor. It's a systemic kind of process, and we don't have places in the world, whether it's environmental risk or social risk or even political risk, as we are seeing at the current point of time, where you can force everybody's hand. It has to be a sort of collective process of decision making. So thanks so much. I think we're going to have very interesting discussions on this as we pick up and run with it, hopefully in the next ICDRI. And hopefully before that happens, we don't have another major compounding and cascading global event. So thank you very much. Thanks very much.
Yeah, on time. Close.